True scary stories from Reddit. Creepypasta tales of being alone at work. The clock on the wall ticked monotonously as the protagonist, Emma, adjusted her glasses and settled into the cold, empty office chair. The fluorescent lights above buzzed faintly in the otherwise silent room. It was after hours, long past the time when everyone else had gone home, and the building was eerily quiet. The hum of the air conditioning was the only sound that broke the stillness. Emma was used to this, working late when the world outside seemed to disappear, leaving her alone in the vast, sterile office. But tonight felt different. There was a sense of isolation that wrapped itself around her like a thick fog, making the space feel more like a mausoleum than a workplace. The dim lights cast long shadows over the empty cubicles, their cold, metallic surfaces gleaming in the low glow. The air felt heavier than usual, as if the walls themselves were pressing in. She could hear the sound of her fingers tapping against the keyboard as she tried to focus on her tasks. The flicker of a light overhead caught her attention, and she paused, glancing up at the ceiling. It flickered again, this time longer than the first. Emma exhaled slowly, trying to shake off the creeping unease. Just the usual tension of working late, she thought to herself, forcing a smile as she returned to her work. Yet, no matter how hard she tried, the feeling didn't go away. The building was too quiet, too still. The isolation seemed almost suffocating. She convinced herself it was just her nerves playing tricks on her, but something deep inside told her that tonight was different. She couldn't explain why, but a sense of foreboding hung in the air, as though something was lurking in the shadows just out of sight, waiting. Emma rubbed her eyes and shook her head, trying to push the thoughts away. She was an office worker, a normal, mundane life, and this was just part of the job. Yet, as she glanced around the room again, her eyes lingered on the empty hallways that stretched beyond the glass walls of the cubicles. They were dark, seemingly endless, and as if to confirm her suspicions, a faint noise echoed from down the corridor. A soft, shuffling sound. Was it just the building settling, or something else? Her heart skipped a beat. She quickly stood up from her desk, chair scraping loudly against the floor. She walked over to the hallway, peering into the gloom. Nothing. The long corridor was deserted, as it always was after hours. No sounds, no movement. She let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding and returned to her desk. As she sat back down, the strange noise came again, louder this time. A soft shuffle, followed by the distinct sound of footsteps echoing through the empty hallways. She stiffened. Her skin prickled, a chill running up her spine. The sound was faint, but it was there. She couldn't deny it. Someone was walking down the hall. But there was no one else in the building. She was certain of that. The office was supposed to be empty. Emma's pulse quickened, and she stood up again, more cautiously this time. She stepped out into the hallway, the eerie quiet enveloping her as she walked toward the source of the sound. The fluorescent lights above flickered once more, casting long, distorted shadows across the floor. As she approached the corner, her breath caught in her throat. Nothing. The hallway stretched endlessly in both directions, silent as ever. She swallowed, trying to steady her racing heart. It's nothing, she told herself. It's just the building. Old pipes, maybe. The air conditioning. Get a grip. But as she returned to her desk, something felt different. It was as if the building had become more alive. The walls seemed to close in a little tighter, the air heavier, the silence more profound. And then there it was again, the faintest rustle, the soft echo of footsteps, this time coming from behind her. Emma whipped around, her eyes scanning the room. She was alone, but the unsettling sensation remained, clawing at her mind. The building felt different. Something was off, and that's when she realized. The longer she stayed in this office, the more the line between what was real and what wasn't seemed to blur. Story 1. The Phantom Caller. Emma sat in the quiet stillness of the office, her eyes fixed on the glowing screen of her computer. The hum of the air conditioner was a constant backdrop, barely noticeable now after hours of solitude. She had long ago become accustomed to the late-night shifts, where the building felt like her own personal space, abandoned by the world. Yet, tonight was different. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, even if she couldn't quite put her finger on it. Her fingers paused over the keyboard when the phone on her desk rang, its sudden noise startling her out of her reverie. It was an unfamiliar number, flashing across the caller ID. A cold shiver ran down her spine, but she quickly dismissed it as a telemarketer or a wrong number. With a sigh, she picked up the receiver. "Hello," she said, her voice shaking slightly. There was no response, just static, a low, crackling buzz that filled the air, making her grip tighten on the receiver. She waited for a few moments, hoping the caller would speak, but the silence stretched on, suffocating and oppressive. She almost hung up, assuming it was a technical glitch, but something about the eerie static made her hesitate. Then, just as abruptly as the call had started, the line went dead. Emma stared at the phone for a moment, her heart beating faster than it should have. "Probably just a wrong number," she muttered to herself, setting the receiver back on the cradle with more force than necessary. She shook her head, willing herself to focus on her work. It was probably nothing, just the weird quirks of late-night office life. But before she could settle back into her chair, the phone rang again. This time, Emma hesitated before answering. Her gut told her to ignore it, but the ringing was relentless. She reached for the receiver, a sense of dread settling into her chest. The number was still unfamiliar, but there was something different this time. She picked up the phone again. "Hello," she said, her voice a little less steady this time. This time, the response wasn't static. It was a voice that was eerily familiar. "Emma," the voice rasped, distorted but unmistakably her own. Her blood ran cold. She gripped the receiver so tightly that her knuckles turned white. "Who is this?" she demanded, her voice quivering despite herself. There was no response, just the steady, unnatural sound of her own voice on the other end, growing clearer with each passing second. It sounded like her, but wrong, distorted, hollow, and somehow wrong in a way that made her skin crawl. The voice continued, and this time, it spoke words that made Emma's stomach twist in knots. "You know what you've done, don't you, Emma?" it said. The words seemed to echo in her mind as much as on the line, a cold weight pressing into her chest. Emma's breath hitched in her throat. How could it know that? How could it know the things she'd buried in the deepest recesses of her mind? It was impossible. Her instinct screamed at her to hang up, to end the call and escape whatever madness was unfolding. But some strange force, kept her there, listening, as the voice on the line began to recount the darkest moments of her past. "You can't hide from it," the voice continued, chilling her to the bone. "You can't outrun what you've left behind." Emma's pulse quickened. She was no longer listening to a simple call. This wasn't just a prank or some technical glitch. This was something more, something personal. The voice on the other end seemed to know every secret she had, every fear she tried to lock away. It was as if the phone line had become a window into her most private thoughts. The voice spoke of events she had long tried to forget, the mistakes she'd made years ago, the guilt she carried, and the people she had wronged. It was as if the voice on the line knew her soul, knew the parts of her that no one else could possibly understand. "Stop," Emma whispered, but her voice was weak, tremulous. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. The memories rushed back to her like a flood, overwhelming her, consuming her. "Who are you?" she gasped. The voice paused for a moment, and then it spoke again, this time with a slow, deliberate tone that made Emma's skin crawl. "You know who I am, Emma. You've always known." The line went dead, leaving her trembling in silence. The eerie hum of the air conditioning seemed to grow louder, more oppressive, as she sat there, her mind spinning. Her heart raced in her chest, her palms slick with sweat. She dropped the receiver back onto its cradle with a shaking hand, the sound of the phone clicking into place echoing in the stillness of the office. For a long moment, Emma simply stared at the phone. Her mind was reeling, the words of the caller still echoing in her ears. How had it known? How could it possibly know the things she had buried so deep? And just as quickly as it had all started, the phone was silent again. But the unease that had taken root in Emma's chest refused to let go. She wasn't alone in the office anymore. Something had changed, something that she couldn't explain. She sat there, waiting, her eyes darting around the empty room. The office that had always been her sanctuary now felt like a tomb. The phone was silent, but the air was thick with tension. Emma couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was still to come. And as the minutes dragged on, she began to wonder who or what was on the other end of that call. Little did she know the worst was yet to come, and it was only a matter of time before the next call arrived. Emma couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The lingering tension in the air, the suffocating silence that wrapped around her like a vice, it all felt too heavy to ignore. After the phone call, her world had shifted, and she couldn't focus on anything anymore. She tried to push it aside, telling herself that she needed to finish the work at hand, but her concentration kept slipping. The glow of her computer screen had become a blur, her fingers hovering above the keyboard, unable to find the words they once so easily typed. Every shadow in the corner of her eye seemed to twitch, and every quiet creak of the building made her jump. She had worked late nights before, but tonight felt different. She could feel eyes on her, even though she was alone. It started with a flicker of movement in the corner of her vision, a shadow darting across the far side of the office. It was gone the moment she turned her head. Emma blinked, staring at the empty cubicles, but everything seemed to be in its place. She forced herself to breathe deeply, telling herself it was just the stress of the day playing tricks on her mind. Yet, the unease didn't subside. If anything, it deepened. Another flicker. This time, she was sure of it. A figure, tall and indistinct, standing just beyond the edge of her line of sight. Her heart skipped a beat. She spun her chair around quickly, but once again, the office remained still. Empty. No one else was there. Her thoughts raced, but the dread in her chest made it impossible to calm her nerves. Was it a trick of the light? Was her mind unraveling after hours of solitude? She rubbed her eyes, hoping to dispel the lingering sense of paranoia. As she refocused on the screen, the phone rang again. The sharp, familiar tone sliced through the silence, making her jump in her seat. With a trembling hand, she reached for the receiver, her heart already pounding in her chest. As she lifted it to her ear, her breath caught in her throat. The line crackled with static, and then the voice returned. Her own voice. "Emma," it whispered cold and hollow. "I see you." Her skin crawled as the voice echoed in her mind, its presence lingering, threatening. She tried to slam the receiver down, but her fingers wouldn't obey. The words that followed sent a chill through her bones. "The clock is ticking, Emma. The answers are hidden here, in the shadows." The line went dead, leaving her with a suffocating silence that felt louder than any noise. The shadows in the office seemed to grow longer, stretching across the walls as if they were alive, watching. Her breathing became shallow, erratic. She put the receiver down carefully, the weight of the phone feeling far heavier than it should. She looked around again, her eyes darting over the empty desks, dim lighting, the flickering fluorescent bulbs above her. It all seemed so normal, yet everything felt wrong. That voice, it was like a presence in the room with her. The knowledge it spoke of was too accurate, too intimate. How could it know? How could it know the things she'd never shared with anyone? It had described her deepest fears, the secrets buried within her. Before she could collect herself, the phone rang again. Her body froze, every muscle tensing. She stared at the screen for a long moment, watching the unfamiliar number flash again. She should ignore it. She knew she should, but she couldn't. "Hello," she answered, her voice trembling. This time, the voice on the other end was colder, more insistent. "You're not alone, Emma. I'm closer than you think." She could hear the faintest hint of a breath, slow, deliberate, before the voice continued. "You've been followed. They've been watching you for years." Her pulse quickened. "Who's watching me?" she demanded, her voice rising in panic. But the voice didn't answer. Instead, it offered a chilling prediction. "You'll see them soon enough. The walls will close in, Emma. You'll be trapped. Everything you fear is already here." The line clicked off before she could respond, leaving her in a state of stunned silence. The words haunted her. "The walls will close in. Everything you fear is already here." She couldn't understand it. What walls? What fear? But the feeling in her chest told her something was terribly wrong. For the next few minutes, she tried to regain control of her thoughts, her breathing. She tried to focus on the mundane tasks before her, hoping that if she could just finish the work, she would be able to shake off this sense of dread. But it was no use. The feeling of being watched never left her. As she glanced around the office, her gaze stopped at the far corner, where a shadow seemed to move just out of the corner of her eye. She turned her head sharply, but it was gone. Again, she swiveled back toward her desk, but this time, the shadow seemed to linger in her peripheral vision, impossible to ignore. It was as though it was moving closer, but always just beyond her line of sight. Her breath caught. Was it just her imagination? Or was something or someone really there? Emma's gaze flitted from corner to corner, from one empty cubicle to the next, her mind racing to make sense of what was happening. The office had always felt safe before, just a place of work. But now it felt like a cage. The walls felt as though they were closing in around her, and the shadows seemed to stretch further with each passing second. Her fingers tightened around the mouse, but she couldn't make herself click anything. Her eyes darted nervously to the door, half expecting someone to appear in the doorway. But it was still empty, still silent. The phone rang again. This time, she didn't even wait. She snatched up the receiver, heart pounding in her chest. But instead of her own voice on the other end, she heard something different, something worse. "This is where it ends, Emma. They're already here." The voice on the other end wasn't just a caller anymore. It was something more, something that had been lurking in the shadows the entire time. And as Emma's gaze lingered on the corner of the office, she saw it. A dark shape moving just out of the light. It was real. She wasn't imagining it. She wasn't alone. And now, she knew that whatever this was, whatever force had been following her, it was far too close. Emma's hands trembled as she gripped the phone once more. Each breath was shallow. Each heartbeat felt like a drumbeat against her chest. The shadows in the corners of the office pressed in closer, as if the walls themselves were conspiring to trap her. Her nerves, stretched taut with every whisper, every distortion in the air, had finally reached their breaking point. She couldn't take it anymore. Phone rang again, its shrill tone a cruel mockery of her own panic. She snatched it up, her voice shaking as she practically shouted into the receiver. "Who are you?" Her voice cracked, her frustration and terror mixing into a raw, desperate cry. "Why are you doing this? What do you want from me?" The line was silent for a moment, just long enough for her to believe she might have finally scared the voice away. But then, that laugh, a low, sinister chuckle, echoed through the receiver. It wasn't just a laugh. It was the sound of something ancient, something vengeful, something that knew her deepest fears. "You still don't know, do you, Emma?" The voice hissed, the words slithering like poison in her ear. "You think you're safe, but you're not. You never were." Her stomach twisted, nausea threatening to overwhelm her. "What do you mean? Who are you?" she cried, her words becoming frantic. The voice answered with slow, deliberate words. "I was someone who once worked here, just like you." It paused, the line crackling with static. "I was wronged, forgotten, left to rot while the rest of you moved on." Emma's pulse quickened, but the voice continued, each word cutting deeper. "I was the one who died here, the one no one remembered. But I remember all of you, Emma. I remember everything." The darkness in the office seemed to thicken, pulling at the edges of her vision. The air felt colder, too cold, and Emma could feel the hairs on her neck rise in response. She instinctively backed away from the desk, but the shadows were closing in. They seemed to follow her every movement, constricting the space, suffocating her. "Who are you?" she demanded again, her throat raw with fear. The voice didn't answer directly. Instead, it said, "I know everything about you. Every little secret. Every terrible thing you've buried deep inside. You can't hide from me anymore, Emma." The blood drained from her face as the voice began to describe her most shameful memory, a past she had long buried in the depths of her mind. "You think you can forget what you did? You think you can just pretend it never happened? I saw it. I saw everything, Emma." Her heart stopped as she realized the voice was speaking of a time long ago, a mistake she had made as a young intern in the office, a mistake that had cost someone their life. The voice continued, cold and malicious. Do you remember him, Emma? The one you abandoned? The one who was left to suffer because of your negligence? You left him to die. You didn't even try to help. And now I am here, because you couldn't forget. Because you wouldn't. Tears stung at the corners of Emma's eyes. Her chest tightened as the weight of the memory crashed down on her. She had thought she'd escaped that guilt, that dark chapter of her life. She had buried it, convinced herself that time would erase it. But it hadn't. And now, this spirit, this vengeful presence, was pulling it all back to the surface. You were the one who caused it, the voice whispered, its tone filled with cold satisfaction. You were the reason I'm dead. You killed me. No, Emma gasped, shaking her head in denial. No, I didn't mean for that to happen. But the voice continued, relentless, unyielding. You left me. You watched as I screamed for help. And now you will pay the price for your mistake, Emma. Her vision blurred with tears. The office had become a twisted mockery of its former self. The walls seemed to pulse, as if breathing, as though the very building was alive, aware of the terror unfolding within its confines. The lights flickered erratically, casting long, grotesque shadows that seemed to stretch toward her like skeletal hands. The phone's receiver felt heavier in her hand, as though the spirit was somehow pulling at it, forcing her to listen. She wanted to hang up, to end the conversation, to escape from the horror that was consuming her. But she couldn't. It was like the very air had turned to cement, trapping her in place. The voice grew louder now, more aggressive, its tone triumphant as it dragged Emma deeper into the supernatural nightmare. You're trapped here, Emma. You can't escape. Not from me. Not from what you did. The building is mine now. It belongs to me, just as your soul will soon belong to me. Emma's eyes darted around the room, panic flooding her system. The office, no, the entire building was shifting before her eyes. The once familiar layout seemed to warp and bend, the walls stretching, the floors sagging as though the very foundation of reality was collapsing. The atmosphere itself seemed to pulse with a sinister energy. She was no longer just in an office. She was inside a nightmare. Please, she begged, her voice a desperate, broken whisper. I'm sorry. I didn't mean for it to happen. I couldn't help. Please. But the voice was unrelenting. Sorry won't save you now, Emma. Nothing will. With a sudden, deafening crash, the office seemed to explode into chaos. The shadows twisted into grotesque forms, reaching out toward her, pulling her in. The walls seemed to close in, compressing her chest, making it harder and harder to breathe. The room was no longer a place of work. It was a cage, a tomb. In a final act of desperation, Emma screamed into the phone. Leave me alone. Please, just let me go. But the spirit only laughed, a dark, hollow sound that seemed to echo through her very soul. For a moment, everything went still. The shadows retreated. The walls stopped moving. The lights returned to their normal flicker. Emma felt her body, trembling, raw with fear but still alive. Her breath was ragged, but she was still here. The voice had stopped. The phone line was silent. She had broken free from the nightmare. The spirit had been silenced, but she could feel it. Even in the calm after the storm, she could feel it. The spirit was still there, lurking in the depths of the building, waiting, watching. It had left its mark on her. Its presence forever burned into her mind. The lines between the living and the dead had blurred, and Emma knew that she would never be the same again. As she slowly placed the receiver back on the hook, her hands trembling uncontrollably, she realized the truth. She was no longer alone. Story 2. The Midnight Delivery. David's headlights cut through the thick, night air as he navigated the desolate road. The clock on his dashboard read 2:47 a.m. Hours passed when most people would have been tucked away in their beds. He had just finished his last few deliveries of the night when dispatch sent him a last-minute call. A last-minute delivery to a location far from the city, something that didn't sit well with him, but the money was good and he needed it. The voice on the line had been hurried, but the address was clear. David had been a delivery driver long enough to know the quiet, rural roads well. But this place felt different. The more he approached the destination, the stronger the sense of unease that crept over him. The roads grew narrower, the trees more dense, and the silence around him more suffocating. It was almost as if the night had swallowed everything around him. Then, finally, as he rounded a bend, the house appeared. It was an old, decrepit building, tucked away in the woods like it had been forgotten by time itself. The structure seemed ancient, with the faintest signs of rot on the wooden beams and peeling paint. It stood there like a relic from another era, casting eerie shadows against the backdrop of the moonlit night. Something about it felt off. Wrong even. David slowed his truck, staring at the house in disbelief. This was the place. He pulled the truck up to the front, parking near the rusted gates that led up to the front door. He took a deep breath, his nerves beginning to fray as he stepped out of the truck. The air felt thick, heavy, like the house itself was drawing him in. David's mind screamed at him to turn around, to drive away. But the money, the promise of a quick delivery, kept him moving forward. The front door of the house creaked open slowly, and a figure emerged from the darkness. It was a man, his features obscured by the shadows, but his posture was rigid and his movement deliberate. Without a word, the figure extended a hand toward the delivery, motioning for David to bring it inside. David hesitated, his gut twisted with discomfort, but he swallowed his unease. It was just a delivery. No need to make things more complicated than they were. He grabbed the package from the back of the truck and approached the front steps. "Hello," David called out, his voice trembling slightly, swallowed by the vast emptiness of the surrounding land. "I've got your order." The figure didn't respond, only continued to gesture for him to come closer. David made his way up the steps, but just as he reached the door, he paused. There was something in the air, an unnatural stillness, a quiet that felt wrong. He could feel the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. He turned to look behind him, half expecting to see something moving in the woods, but nothing stirred. "Hello?" David asked again, louder this time, his unease growing. Still no response. Just as David began to set the package down at the threshold, ready to leave, a sound broke the silence. Soft footsteps, heavy and deliberate, echoed from behind him. David froze. The footsteps weren't coming from the figure in front of him. No, they were coming from somewhere inside the house. His heart pounded in his chest as he spun around, expecting to see someone standing in the doorway behind him. But there was nothing. The front porch remained empty, as desolate as it had been when he arrived. He glanced back over his shoulder, but the figure at the door was gone as well. David's breath quickened. His pulse hammered in his ears as he stepped backward, his hand instinctively reaching for his phone. He checked the time again, still 2:55 a.m. No one had shown up to meet him, and the figure that had been at the door had vanished without a trace. What was going on? He turned back to look at the house. It was silent, but there was something about the stillness that didn't sit right with him. Everything felt wrong. He should have left. He should have gotten in his truck and driven away without another thought. But instead, his feet felt like they were frozen to the ground, the weight of an invisible force pulling him closer to the door. And then it happened. The door creaked open wider, revealing an empty hallway bathed in shadow. David could feel the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end, the cold seeping into his bones. He took a step toward the house, instinct pulling him forward despite the gnawing fear building in the pit of his stomach. "Hello?" David called again, his voice barely more than a whisper now. No answer. Then something caught his eye. In the darkness of the hallway, he saw movement, a figure moving swiftly past the doorway. For a split second, he thought he saw someone standing inside, watching him. But before he could react, the figure was gone. David's heart skipped a beat, his legs now trembling with adrenaline. He turned quickly, casting one last glance at the truck, at the safety it represented. But his feet refused to move. His body felt rooted to the spot, his pulse quickening as the tension in the air thickened. The footsteps, distant yet growing louder, echoed again behind him. He turned sharply, only to find the porch empty once more. But the figure, the one who had greeted him at the door, was nowhere to be seen. In its place, there was nothing but an unnerving silence that hung in the air like a thick fog. David's mind screamed at him to leave, to get back in his truck and drive away as fast as he could. But something kept him standing there, his body frozen in place. The chill of the night air crept into his bones as he slowly turned back toward the house, the door now ajar. The shadows inside seemed to shift and sway, as though they were alive. The footsteps grew closer. Then, as if guided by instinct, David took a final step forward. He could not stop himself. Every cell in his body screamed in protest, but his feet moved of their own accord, carrying him over the threshold of the old, decrepit house. And when he crossed the doorway, it was as though the house swallowed him whole. The door slammed shut behind him, cutting off his only escape. In the silence, David realized he was no longer alone. David's hands gripped the steering wheel tighter as he sped down the winding road. The lights of his truck cut through the dark landscape, but no matter how fast he drove, the unsettling feeling that had settled in his chest refused to dissipate. His mind raced, trying to rationalize what had just happened. It was a simple delivery, he tried to tell himself. But it wasn't simple. The house, the figure, the eerie silence. It was all wrong. He had delivered packages to strange places before, but never one like this. The unease gnawed at him as he navigated the dark highway. He glanced at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see headlights following him, or a shadowy figure from the house, somehow trailing in his wake. But the road behind him was empty, as it should be. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. David reached for his phone, hoping the distraction would take his mind off the strange events that had just unfolded. As he scrolled through his messages, his phone suddenly rang. The number was unfamiliar, and for a moment, David hesitated. He didn't want to deal with any more surprises tonight. But with a sigh, he answered the call. "Hello," David said, his voice tinged with the exhaustion of a long shift. At first, there was nothing but silence on the other end, just the quiet hum of static and the faint sound of a distant wind. He was about to hang up when a voice, familiar yet strange, crackled through the speaker. "You shouldn't have gone inside," the voice whispered, low and urgent. It sent a chill down David's spine, his heart skipping a beat as he tried to place the voice. It wasn't anyone he recognized, yet it sounded so close. "You shouldn't have entered the house." David's breath caught in his throat. He stared at the phone, his thumb frozen above the button to end the call. He knew he had heard that voice before, though he couldn't say where. It was distant, as though coming from somewhere deep inside his memory, yet unmistakable. He leaned closer to the phone, listening intently. "What do you mean?" David asked, his voice shaky despite his efforts to sound composed. "Who is this?" The voice on the other end was softer now, almost sorrowful. The customer wasn't real. None of it was real. "You've made a mistake. You should have turned back when you had the chance." David felt his chest tighten, his fingers trembling as he gripped the phone. This couldn't be happening. It was just a prank, a wrong number, or some twisted coincidence. He had to ignore it, but the more he tried to push it away, the more it consumed him. The voice continued to speak, but now it was more urgent, more insistent. "Get out of there. It's not over. It's never over." Before David could respond, the line went dead. The sudden silence in his truck was deafening, the eerie words still ringing in his mind. His phone screen flashed again, another call from the same unknown number. His hand hovered over the screen, his instincts screaming at him to ignore it, to focus on the road ahead. But something kept him from hanging up. He answered again, only to be met with the same unsettling silence. David's grip on the wheel tightened as he pressed on the accelerator, trying to outrun the fear creeping up his spine. The road stretched endlessly before him, no end in sight. The glow of his headlights barely illuminated the path ahead. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, though no one was around. And then, just as he glanced in the rearview mirror again, his blood ran cold. At the edge of his vision, in the dim light cast by his headlights, he saw a figure standing by the window of the house. It was hard to make out the details, but the shape was unmistakable. A person. No, not just anyone, but the same figure he had seen earlier, the one who had greeted him at the door. But that was impossible. He had just left moments ago. The house had been empty when he left, hadn't it? Yet there was someone or something watching him. David's pulse quickened, his hands growing slick with sweat as his foot hovered over the gas pedal. The figure remained in the window, unmoving, like a shadow cast against the fading glow of the house. The distance between David and the house was widening, but it felt like the figure's gaze was still fixed on him. His mind raced. Could it be the same person? Was he imagining things? His eyes darted to the rearview mirror again, but the figure had vanished. A cold chill seeped into the car, though the windows were closed. The oppressive silence outside pressed against him, and the air felt thick, suffocating. It was as if the world had gone quiet, the hum of the tires against the road fading into nothing. David's phone rang again, the same unknown number. Before he could even answer, the voice returned, this time more frantic, more desperate. Turn back. Don't drive any further. It's watching you. It's watching you right now. David's heart pounded as he glanced around. The road stretched out before him, desolate and endless. There was no one on the road, nothing to suggest that he was being followed. But the voice knew. It knew exactly where he was, and it was warning him. Who is this? David shouted into the phone, his frustration building as panic began to cloud his thoughts. Who are you? The voice responded, this time clearer, but still distorted. You're not alone. It never lets anyone leave. You made a mistake, and now you're trapped. We're all trapped. David slammed his hand against the dashboard, his nerves fraying. What do you want from me? He yelled, but the line went silent again. And then in the corner of his eye, he saw it. The figure from the window, standing at the edge of the road, watching him. Just outside his headlights, the figure was still there, somehow impossibly close, yet fading into the night. David's breath caught in his throat as he tried to keep his focus on the road. The phone rang one last time. David's hands shook as he answered it. But this time, there was only one thing the voice said. You shouldn't have gone inside. The line went dead. David gripped the wheel harder, his knuckles white. The air felt impossibly still, but his heart raced. What had he gotten himself into? And was he ever truly going to escape? David's pulse quickened as he pressed harder on the accelerator, his eyes darting nervously between the rearview mirror and the empty road ahead. The eerie stillness of the night seemed to close in around him, suffocating him with every passing mile. His mind raced, trying to process the last few hours. What had started as an ordinary delivery had now spiraled into an endless nightmare. It had all begun when he entered that abandoned house. The figure in the doorway, the strange phone calls, and the growing sense of dread that had settled over him like a shadow. But now, it felt like the entire town had conspired to trap him. Every street, every turn felt deliberate, like a maze designed to make him lose his way. The world outside had warped, becoming something unrecognizable, as if the night itself was closing in on him. David kept glancing at the rearview mirror, where the figure had been moments ago, always there, always following. At first, he thought it was just a trick of his mind, an illusion brought on by exhaustion or fear. But no matter how fast he drove, the figure remained. The faint silhouette of someone, or something, lurking in the darkness, its eyes fixed on him, tracking his every move. The light of his headlights barely cut through the heavy fog that had settled over the road. The trees on either side of him seemed to grow taller, their branches twisting into grotesque shapes that clawed at the sky. It felt like he was driving through a tunnel that was closing in on him, the walls narrowing with every mile. David's hands trembled as he gripped the steering wheel. His knuckles were white from the pressure, his entire body shaking with fear. He couldn't outrun it. No matter how fast he drove, it felt like the town itself was part of some elaborate trap, pulling him deeper into its grip. His phone rang again. This time, David didn't hesitate. He snatched the phone from the passenger seat and pressed it to his ear, desperate for any semblance of control, any connection to the outside world. Hello? His voice cracked, hoarse from the fear that had been building inside him. The voice on the other end was distorted, just as it had been before. But now there was something different, something more malicious about it. It laughed, a hollow, echoing sound that sent chills down David's spine. You think you can escape? The voice sneered. You're already too late. David's eyes shot to the rearview mirror. The figure was there again, closer now. He could make out the outline of its face, pale, with hollow eyes that seemed to stare right through him. The figure's mouth moved, but no sound came. With a surge of panic, David slammed his foot on the gas, pushing the truck faster. He could feel the engine straining under the pressure, the tires screeching against the pavement as he tore down the road. But no matter how fast he went, the figure stayed just behind him, always within reach. It was as if the world itself had locked him in place, forcing him to face whatever nightmare was unfolding. "Why won't you leave me alone?" David shouted into the phone, his voice trembling with desperation. "What do you want from me?" The voice on the other end paused, and for a moment there was nothing but static. Then it returned, quieter, almost as though it were whispering from somewhere far away. "You can't run forever," the voice said, the words laced with an almost affectionate cruelty. "The house is in your blood now. You're part of it." David's breath caught in his throat. He could hear the faint rumble of the truck's engine beneath the voice, but there was something else now. A low, ominous sound, like the earth itself groaning in response. The road in front of him seemed to stretch endlessly, the same stretch of barren highway repeating itself with each passing second. The trees, the fog, the very ground beneath him, they all seemed to warp, as if he were stuck in a loop that wouldn't end. David's heart raced as his mind swirled with panic. He had to get out. He had to find a way to break free. Suddenly, a thought pierced through the haze of fear. The police. David fumbled for his phone, his fingers slick with sweat as he dialed 911. The call rang once, twice, and then, 911, what's your emergency? David's voice cracked as he spoke, each word coming out in frantic gasps. "I'm being followed. Someone is after me. Please, you have to help me. I'm trapped in the middle of nowhere." The operator's voice was calm, professional, but it felt so far away. "Sir, can you give me your location?" David's hands shook as he looked out the windshield. The road ahead was still the same endless stretch of darkness. He couldn't tell where he was. It was as if the town had swallowed him whole. "I don't know," he stammered, his voice barely audible. "It's all wrong. Please, just help me." There was a pause on the line, and then the operator's voice returned, quieter this time. "Stay calm, sir. Help is on the way. Just keep driving." David didn't wait to hear more. He slammed the phone back into the passenger seat and pushed the accelerator to the floor, hoping beyond hope that the help would come before it was too late. But even as he sped down the road, he knew deep down that nothing would ever be the same again. The figure in the rearview mirror was gone, but David could still feel it, lurking just beyond his vision. Watching, waiting, the fog around him grew thicker, swallowing the truck whole, until there was nothing left but darkness. For a brief moment, it felt like he had escaped. The town was behind him, and the haunting presence seemed to vanish with the headlights. But just as quickly, the silence was broken again. The phone rang. David reached for it, his hand trembling as he saw the caller ID. An unknown number, of course. But this time, when he answered, there was no voice at all. Only a low, rattling breath that filled his ears, followed by a chilling whisper. "You'll never leave. None of us do." The call cut off, and the truck's headlights flickered. David could feel the weight of the town pressing down on him again, the endless maze closing in. He couldn't escape. He was trapped, just like all the others who had come before him. The police would never arrive. No one would ever leave this place. And as the truck's engine sputtered, David realized with a sinking heart that the land, the house, and everything in it had a far darker history than he could ever understand. He wasn't just being followed. He was part of the story now, and there would be no escaping. Both stories, the phantom caller and the midnight delivery, weave a tale of terror that goes beyond mere physical danger. They delve into the psychological labyrinths of the mind, examining how the protagonist's worst fears and insecurities manifest in ways that blur the line between the real world and the supernatural. In The Phantom Caller, the protagonist's sense of safety is shattered by a mysterious and vengeful spirit that appears to know every intimate detail of their life, exposing a dark secret they have long buried. This unseen force not only manipulates the protagonist's reality, but drives them to question their own sanity. The haunted building, much like their troubled past, becomes a prison, trapping them in a cycle of dread that they cannot escape. The unseen presence bends the physical world around the protagonist, making them doubt what's real and what is imagined, creating a nightmare that feels all too tangible. Similarly, in The Midnight Delivery, the protagonist's sense of safety is upended by an eerie delivery to a strange, desolate house. What begins as an innocuous job quickly spirals into a supernatural nightmare, where reality begins to warp around the protagonist, and they become trapped in a never-ending cycle of fear and confusion. The mysterious figure that follows them becomes a symbol of the town's hidden horrors and the protagonist's inescapable fate. As the protagonist drives through endless, empty roads, they realize that their attempt to escape is futile. The town and its horrors are forever entwined with their fate. Both stories explore a similar theme: feeling trapped, whether physically in a haunted building or metaphorically by one's past. The protagonists in both narratives are pulled into situations that feel impossible to understand or escape, manipulated by forces beyond their control. These forces shape their experiences, leading them through a nightmarish journey where reality and fear blend together in ways that are difficult to distinguish. In both stories, the protagonist's initial instinct is to ignore or deny their fears. In The Phantom Caller, the protagonist tries to rationalize the calls and the strange occurrences, pushing aside their suspicions until it's too late. In The Midnight Delivery, the protagonist attempts to outrun the mysterious figure and avoid confronting the house's dark history. This denial only serves to amplify the horror, as the invisible forces, whether the spirit in the office or the town's buried secrets, grow stronger, preying on the protagonist's deepest anxieties. The key lesson in both stories is that everything around us may not be as it seems, and we must trust our instincts to survive, both in the physical world and the supernatural realm. Ignoring the warning signs, the unsettling feelings, and the sense that something isn't right can lead to disastrous consequences. The protagonists in both tales learn this lesson too late, finding themselves trapped in cycles of terror that they can't break free from. Furthermore, these stories reflect on the psychological scars we carry, those wounds from the past that we try to bury, but which have a way of resurfacing when least expected. Whether it's the secret guilt in The Phantom Caller or the haunting history of The Midnight Delivery, the past is never truly gone. It lingers, festering in the background, waiting for the right moment to make itself known. For the protagonists, confronting these past mistakes or the horrors of their surroundings is the only way to truly escape. However, by the time they realize this, it is often too late, and they find themselves facing consequences far greater than they ever anticipated. These narratives serve as stark reminders that our fears, whether tangible or psychological, have the power to shape our reality. And when we fail to face them head-on, they may take on monstrous forms, trapping us in ways we never thought possible. Ultimately, both The Phantom Caller and The Midnight Delivery underscore the fragility of our reality, revealing how it can easily fracture under the weight of fear and the secrets we carry. As the protagonists discover, the things they try to outrun, whether it's a vengeful spirit or an inescapable town, always have a way of catching up with them. The lessons they learn are painful but essential. Trust your instincts, confront your fears, and never underestimate the power of the past. In the end, these stories serve not only as chilling tales of horror, but as cautionary reminders of the dangers that lie in ignoring our intuition, our history, and the things that go bump in the night.